My father signed away the best years of his own house in about the time it takes to pour a cup of coffee, and it would be 2 years before I understood he'd already given away something far more valuable than that, on paper, without telling a soul in the family. I asked my father to move into the guest house so my wife and kids could have the main one. That's the plain version of it. The version I told myself was reasonable at the time. We were standing on the back porch of the house he'd lived in for 31 years, looking out at the guest house across the yard, a tidy 2-bedroom cottage he'd built himself in the 90s for my grandmother before she passed. The evening light doing that particular gold thing it does over the tree line in April, and I told him that with 3 kids and a 4th on the way. We simply needed the space more than he did, that it made sense for him to take the smaller place and let us have the main house. He didn't ask me to explain myself twice. He looked out at the yard for a moment, the way he used to look at a fence line before deciding where to run a new section, and said, "That makes sense, Nathan." He started moving his things across the yard the following weekend, without a single complaint, without asking for anything in return. That weekend itself is something I've turned over a lot since. My father packed methodically, the way he did everything, boxing up decades of a life in a single Saturday, with the kids running boxes back and forth across the yard like it was a game, shrieking with laughter every time one of them tripped over the uneven grass. Danielle bringing out lemonade, my father directing traffic from the porch with the same calm authority he'd once used to direct a construction crew building the very house we were now emptying around him. I remember him pausing at one point, halfway through emptying the hall closet, holding a small cedar box I'd never seen before, turning it over once in his hands before setting it carefully into a bag of his own rather than one of the moving boxes the rest of us were filling. A detail I noticed only in passing that day and didn't think about again until the letter arrived 18 months later. By Sunday evening, the main house was ours, and my father was settled into the guest house with what looked, even that first night, like a man who'd already made his peace with the change days or weeks before any of us started carrying boxes. I didn't understand, not then, that he'd already signed away something on that property 18 months before I ever asked him to move, and that the letter confirming it wouldn't come to me. It would come to him, at the guest house, addressed to a man the county and a development company both understood to still own every acre of that land, a fact none of the rest of us had any reason to question until the postman got the mailbox wrong. My name is Nathan Halbrook. I'm 42. I sell commercial insurance out of an office 20 minutes from the 14 acres my father has owned outside town since 1979, and I live, along with my wife Danielle and our kids, in the main house on that property, a house my father built with his own hands the same year I was born. I have 5 children now, the youngest still in diapers, and a mother who passed 6 years ago, which left my father managing that property alone for longer than any of us were entirely comfortable with before Danielle and I moved back, a stretch of about 3 years where he lived on that land by himself, cooking his own dinners, mowing that whole yard on a tractor that was already older than me, and never once complaining about any of it when we called to check in. I want to walk through exactly how this happened, in the order it happened, because I've come to believe a story like this only means what it's supposed to mean if you tell it in sequence, without skipping ahead to the part that stings. This isn't a confession dressed up as an apology. It's an account, and I intend to give it to you plainly, including the parts where I believed, with real conviction, that I was doing right by a man I loved. My father, Walter Halbrook, bought those 14 acres in 1979 for $11,000, land nobody else wanted at the time because half of it sat on a rocky slope that made it useless for the kind of row crop farming most of our neighbors were doing, land the previous owner had practically begged him to take off his hands rather than keep paying taxes on it. He drove out to look at it 3 separate times before making an offer, my mother used to say, walking the whole perimeter each time with a notebook he never showed anyone, a habit she found maddening as a young wife eager to settle somewhere and start their life together, though she'd later admit, once the land had proven itself worth every bit of that patience, that she'd never once seen him make a genuinely bad call on that property in over 40 years of marriage. My father didn't farm it. He cleared enough of it by hand to build a house, kept the rest wooded, and spent the better part of 4 decades quietly paying down what little debt he'd taken on, refusing every offer that came along from developers who wanted to buy him out as the town grew closer to his fence line over the years, offers that, by the time I was in my 20s, had climbed into 6 figures for the whole parcel. Numbers he'd mentioned to my mother over dinner with the same flat tone he used for weather reports. He had one habit that everyone in the family came to recognize. He never made a decision about that land quickly, not even a small one, and he never explained his reasoning until long after the decision was already made, if he explained it at all. My mother used to say he thought in seasons, not afternoons, that you could ask him about a fence repair in March and not hear his actual answer until the ground had thawed enough in April for him to walk the line himself. My aunt, my mother's sister, used to complain about it good-naturedly at every family gathering, telling a story about asking my father once, decades ago, whether he'd help fund a shared fence between their 2 properties, and waiting nearly 6 weeks for an answer that turned out to be a full survey of both parcels and a proposal more thorough than anything the county itself had on file, complete with cost estimates broken down by material and a maintenance schedule she still keeps taped inside a kitchen cabinet to this day. Half joke and half genuine reverence for how seriously he'd taken offense neither of them particularly cared about. I used to find that frustrating as a younger man, the way he'd sit on a question for weeks that seemed, to me, to have an obvious answer, wanting him to just decide already the way I decided things, quickly, based on whatever information was in front of me at the time. It would turn out to matter more than almost anything else in this story. There's a story about my father I think about often now, one he only told once, at my wedding rehearsal dinner years before any of this began, half to the table and half to himself. The kind of story that only comes out once the occasion makes it feel appropriate to share something genuinely personal, standing there in his one good suit with a glass of wine he barely touched all night. In 1987, a developer offered him $90,000 for the whole 14 acres, an enormous sum at the time, enough to clear every debt he had and buy a comfortable house in town outright. At a moment when my mother was between jobs and money was tighter than either of them ever let on to me as a child. Tighter, I'd learn much later, than most of the neighbors around us ever knew either. My father turned it down without consulting her first, a decision she was furious about for the better part of a month, according to my aunt, who still brings it up at family gatherings as though it happened last year, doing an impression of my mother's reaction that always gets a laugh even though none of us were there to see the original argument. He told me, and only me, years later, sitting on this same porch with 2 beers between us on a summer evening, when I'd asked him directly why he'd taken such a risk with a young family depending on him, that he'd turned it down not out of stubbornness, but because he'd already decided, quietly, that the land would be worth more to his grandchildren someday than the money would ever be worth to him, a bet he made on a future he wouldn't necessarily live to see fully play out. A kind of patience I didn't fully appreciate until I had children of my own old enough to make me think in decades rather than years. I didn't think much of that story when he told it at my rehearsal dinner. I filed it, the way I filed most of his stories, under old-fashioned sentiment rather than genuine foresight, when it turned out, decades later, to be exactly the latter. By the time I was an adult with a family of my own, my father had settled into a quiet routine on that land, working part-time doing small engine repair out of a shed behind the guest house, keeping mostly to himself, showing up for Sunday dinner at our place in town before we eventually moved back onto the property ourselves. He never remarried after my mother passed, never seemed to want to, and filled his days with the kind of small, careful work that had always suited him, a neighbor's chainsaw here, a riding mower there, done at a price so far below market that Danielle used to joke he was running a charity out of that shed rather than a repair business, a joke he took in stride every time she made it at Sunday dinner. When Danielle and I decided, 4 years ago, to move our growing family onto my father's land rather than build or buy elsewhere, it was framed, by both of us, as an arrangement that would let us help him as he got older while giving our kids the kind of space and yard we could never have afforded on our own. We moved into a smaller cabin on the property at first, converted from an old workshop, while my father stayed in the main house. That arrangement worked well enough for 2 years. But by the time our fourth child was on the way, the cabin had become genuinely too small, and the math of the situation, at least the math I could see, pointed in one clear direction: my father, at 75. Living alone in a 4-bedroom house with a yard he could no longer keep up himself, made considerably less practical use of that space than a family of 6 about to become 7. I told myself, and I told Danielle more than once, that this wasn't about pushing my father aside, that it was simply an honest accounting of who needed what, and that a man his age would likely be more comfortable in a smaller, easier to manage space anyway. That belief had real substance to it. It was also, I'll admit, considerably easier to hold on to than the alternative, which was that I wanted the bigger house for my own family and had built a tidy justification around wanting it. The conversation itself happened on a Saturday evening in April, out on the back porch of the main house, the two of us watching the kids chase fireflies in the yard while Danielle put the youngest to bed inside, the same porch where he used to sit with my mother most evenings after dinner, coffee in hand, a habit I'd noticed he'd kept up alone in the years since she passed. I'd rehearsed the framing for nearly 2 weeks by then, testing different versions of it on Danielle at night after the kids were asleep, settling on language that emphasized practicality over sacrifice, careful to strip out anything that might sound like I was asking him to give something up, rather than simply recognizing a fact about our respective needs. A script I'd practically memorized by the time I finally sat down to deliver it. I told my father that with the new baby coming, we were going to need the extra bedrooms more than he did, that the guest house had everything he needed: a full kitchen, a walk-in shower without stairs, a smaller yard that wouldn't demand as much of him, and that I thought it made sense for us to switch places. Us into the main house, him into the guest house. I watched his face while I said it, bracing for some pushback I'd already prepared counter-arguments for. The memories in that house, the garden he'd kept along the south wall since before I was born, the porch he'd built with his own 2 hands the summer before I started high school, the bedroom that had been my mother's for 30 years, the kitchen where she'd taught me to cook the few things I still know how to make. There wasn't any pushback. He looked out at the yard for a long moment, the same unhurried look he used to give a fence line before deciding where a new section needed to go, and said, "That makes sense, Nathan." Then he asked whether I thought the kids would want to help him move his workbench, since it was heavier than it looked, and whether I thought Saturday or Sunday would work better for borrowing my truck. Already 3 steps ahead of logistics I hadn't even begun to think through myself. That was the entirety of it. No negotiation, no request for anything in return, nothing that would have given me a single reason to reconsider even if I'd been looking for one. And I remember feeling, driving to work that Monday, a quiet satisfaction at how cleanly the whole thing had gone. Danielle was on the porch for the tail end of that conversation, having come back out once the baby was down, and she caught my arm once my father had gone back inside to start sorting which of his things he'd need first. She asked me, quietly, standing in the doorway with her arms crossed against the evening chill, whether I'd really given him room to say no, or whether I'd simply presented the move as already decided and let him nod along the way he tended to do with most things that weren't worth a fight to him. I told her that Dad had every opportunity to push back and hadn't, that I trusted him to tell me directly if something didn't sit right, and that a man who'd spent his whole life making decisions slowly wasn't the kind of man who'd agree to something this size without meaning it. Danielle didn't argue the point, but she said something as we went back inside that I filed away and didn't think much of again for the better part of 2 years. He agreed awfully fast for a man who thinks in seasons. I told her she was reading too much into a practical conversation about square footage. I believed that completely at the time, and I remember feeling faintly annoyed that she'd complicated something I'd wanted to consider settled and, frankly, something I'd been a little proud of handling so smoothly. The 18 months that followed were, in almost every way that mattered to me, some of the best our family had. Our 5th child arrived that summer, a girl this time after 4 boys, the main house filled up with the particular chaos of a family of 7. Diapers and homework and cleats scattered across a mudroom that had felt spacious when it was just my father living there alone. And my father settled into the guest house with what looked, from where I stood, like genuine ease. He kept his workbench in the little shed out back, fixed small engines for neighbors the same as always, came over for dinner most nights, sat on our porch afterward with a cup of decaf while the kids ran themselves out before bed. Taught my oldest how to change the oil on a lawnmower one Saturday that spring, and never once, in all that time, brought up the house swap again, not as a complaint, not even as a passing comment. I remember thinking, watching him with the kids on the porch some evenings, that he seemed happier in that smaller house than he had in years, freer somehow. Though I understand now I was reading contentment into a man who had simply finished the only part of his life that still required him to worry, and had nothing left to carry that showed on his face. I took his silence as confirmation that the arrangement suited him fine, that whatever adjustment there'd been had settled into something he no longer thought about. The way most things settled with him once a decision was made. There were 3 things, small things, that I noted during that stretch, and didn't think much of until they mattered. The first was that summer, when my father mentioned, almost in passing over dinner while passing the potatoes, that he'd had a meeting with an attorney in town, a man named Curtis Alden, whose name I recognized only vaguely from a firm that handled land and estate matters for half the county. The kind of practice that put up modest signage and relied entirely on word of mouth. I'd met Curtis exactly once before, at a Rotary fundraiser years earlier, and remembered him only as a quiet man in a gray suit who'd shaken my hand and said almost nothing else the entire evening. The kind of person you forget the moment they leave a room. My father said it the way you'd mention a dentist appointment, brief and unremarkable. I asked what it was about. Getting some old paperwork sorted, he said, and reached for the potatoes without elaborating further. I didn't press, assuming it was ordinary estate planning, the kind of thing a man his age handles quietly and doesn't much like discussing at the dinner table in front of grandchildren who wouldn't understand it anyway. The second was that fall, when I noticed a survey crew working the back 9 acres of the property for the better part of a week, flagging trees and running string lines through the wooded section my father had never cleared. A section I'd walked maybe a handful of times in my whole life, since it wasn't good for much beyond firewood, as far as I'd ever understood it. A stretch of woods I mostly associated with the one time I got lost in it as a kid, chasing our old dog, and had to be found by my father with a flashlight well after dark. I asked him about it in passing, catching him coming back from the tree line one evening with mud on his boots. He said a county surveyor had come by to update some old boundary records that hadn't been touched since the original 1979 purchase, and that it was a routine thing landowners had to deal with from time to time, paperwork catching up with reality after enough decades had passed. I remember thinking it was a mildly inconvenient errand for him to have to manage alone at his age, and I offered to help coordinate it if it came up again, maybe take a half-day off work to walk the line with him. He said he had it handled, and we moved on to talking about the kids' school schedule for the coming year, the survey crew disappearing from my thoughts as completely as they disappeared from the property within the week. The third was smaller still, my father mentioned, one evening that winter while we were splitting firewood together behind the guest house, our breath showing in the cold. The kind of companionable silence between us that had defined most of our working hours together since I was a boy, that he'd been getting some old business squared away with Curtis. A phrase he delivered the way he delivered most things he considered settled and not worth elaborating on further. I asked if he needed anything from me on it. He said no, it was mostly things that wouldn't mean much to anyone but him. And then he asked whether I thought the woodpile would last us through February, which was his way of ending a conversation he considered finished. None of these 3 things alarmed me. Each one, taken alone, was the kind of unremarkable detail that fills an ordinary year for a man easing into a quieter chapter of his life. An old friend at a law firm. A routine survey. Some paperwork nobody discusses at length. It was only much later that I understood they weren't separate at all, and that each of them pointed toward the same thing. My father, quietly and on his own initiative, managing an asset I had never once considered separately from the house I'd asked him to give up, an asset that had never once shown up in any conversation I'd had with him about what he needed or didn't need. The turn came on a Thursday in October, roughly 18 months after that April conversation on the porch, when a certified letter arrived at the guest house addressed to Walter Halbrook, forwarded to me by mistake for a single confused moment before I realized the name on the envelope wasn't mine, and handed it across the yard to my father myself. The mailbox at the head of the drive still serving both houses the way it always had. A detail neither of us had ever thought to change since the swap. He read it standing in his own doorway, reading glasses pushed up his nose, the afternoon sun catching the porch steps he'd built himself decades before I ever asked him to give them up. And I watched something in his posture settle rather than tense, the reaction of a man confirming an outcome rather than absorbing a surprise. A stillness I recognized only in hindsight as the opposite of shock. He invited me in and handed me the letter without a word, gesturing toward the kitchen table where he'd once eaten breakfast every morning of my childhood before the swap moved that table across the yard with him. It was from a regional land development firm called Ridgeline Development Partners, informing Walter Halbrook. As the sole titled owner of the 9 wooded acres behind the guest house, that the company was exercising the second stage payment on an option to purchase agreement executed the previous spring, a full year before I'd ever proposed the house swap, for the eventual development of a mixed-use commercial corridor tied to a new state highway interchange planned 2 miles down the road. A project that had been quietly working its way through county planning approvals for over 2 years without ever once crossing my radar as anything more than local news I skimmed and forgot, the kind of headline you register and move past on your way to the sports section. The letter cited a total option value of $1.4 million across 3 staged payments, the first of which, according to the letter, had already been disbursed and deposited the previous June. Sitting in an account I hadn't known existed until that exact moment at my father's kitchen table, an account Curtis had apparently helped him open at a bank 2 towns over specifically, so that no local teller who knew our family would ever have reason to mention it in passing at the grocery store the way small. Towns tend to let things slip. I sat down across from him, the letter still in my hands, and asked him, as evenly as I could manage, how long he'd known this was coming. He told me Curtis had first raised the possibility of the interchange rezoning back when I was still living in the cabin with Danielle and the first 3 kids. Well over 2 years earlier, long before I'd ever said a word to him about the guest house, back when the whole idea of the swap hadn't even occurred to me yet. He'd spent the better part of that year quietly working with Curtis to have the back 9 acres surveyed and separated from the parcel the 2 houses sat on, executing the option agreement with Ridgeline the spring before I ever brought up the swap, structuring the whole thing so that the payments would fund his own long-term care and leave something substantial for his grandchildren. All of it done without a single conversation with me, his own son, about any part of it. Not even a hint over dinner that something of this scale was moving quietly in the background of an ordinary year. I asked him why. He looked at me for a moment, unhurried, the same look he used to give a fence line, and said, "You asked me about the house. Nathan, you never asked about the land." That was the fact that reframed everything. The arrangement I'd built my justification around, that I was simply making an honest accounting of who needed which house more, had never touched the actual asset that mattered most on that property, because that asset had never been the house to begin with, a distinction I'd never once had reason to draw until that letter forced it on me at his kitchen table. My father hadn't agreed to move into the guest house because he'd run out of reasons to say no. He'd agreed because, by the time I asked, the guest house and the house swap around it had already become the smallest part of what he was actually managing on that land, a decision he'd made and secured entirely on his own timeline. Long before I'd convinced myself I was the one being generous by including him in an arrangement I'd already decided. I thought about the survey crew that fall, the meeting with Curtis I'd assumed was ordinary paperwork, the woodpile conversation that had ended a much larger discussion before I ever knew it had started, and understood that every one of those small, forgettable moments had been the actual substance of what my father was doing with his last years of full ownership over that land, while I'd spent that same stretch of time congratulating myself for handling a square-footage conversation with tact, proud of a generosity that had cost me nothing and revealed considerably less than I'd assumed it did. I called Danielle from my truck before I even drove home, sitting in my father's gravel driveway with the letter on the passenger seat, and told her everything. My voice steadier than I expected it to be given how unsteady I actually felt. She was quiet for a long moment on the line, and then she said the thing I'd been half expecting since that night on the porch 2 years earlier. I told you he agreed too fast. I didn't argue with her, because there wasn't anything left to argue. She asked whether I thought he'd have told us eventually, on his own timeline, if that letter had never come, or whether he'd have let the whole arrangement stay quiet indefinitely, tucked behind an ordinary life of dinners and firewood and small engine repairs, never once surfacing unless circumstances forced it into the open the way they finally had. I told her I didn't know, and that the not knowing bothered me more than almost anything else about the day. The possibility that my father had built an entire second life around that land that none of us would ever have learned about if a certified letter hadn't happened to arrive at the wrong mailbox first. A thought that kept me sitting in that driveway another 20 minutes after we'd hung up, unwilling yet to walk back across the yard to my own house. I sat with him a long while that afternoon, the letter between us on the table, the light through the kitchen window shifting as the afternoon wore on, a clock on the wall that had hung in the main house kitchen my whole childhood before making the trip across the yard with everything else. And I told him the first thing plainly, because I believed it deserved to be said plainly, that I had misjudged him, not because I thought he'd become incapable of managing his own affairs, but because I had mistaken his quick agreement to the house swap for a man who had simply run out of leverage or reasons to resist, when in fact he'd already secured, on his own initiative, something considerably larger than the house I'd asked him to give up. I told him I'd spent 2 years believing I was the one being generous in that arrangement, when the truth was he'd already arranged his own future so completely that my offer had cost him nothing worth arguing over. He listened without interrupting, the way he always had, and when I finished, he turned his coffee cup slowly on the table, the same worn mug he'd used since before my mother passed, a chip on its handle from some accident decades ago that he'd never bothered replacing it over, and said, "You gave me a smaller house, Nathan. I made sure it didn't cost me anything that mattered. It wasn't delivered with any edge. It was delivered the way he delivered most things, plain and complete, uninterested in whether I found it comfortable to hear." I asked him, and I heard something in my own voice I didn't especially care for, why he'd never told me any of it, why he'd let me believe, for 2 full years, that the house swap had been the whole of the arrangement between us, when he could have told me at any point that he'd already secured something far larger on his own, at any Sunday dinner, any evening splitting wood, any of the dozens of ordinary hours we'd spent together on that property since the move, any of the mornings I'd walked past his workbench on my way to check the garden, close enough to have asked, and never once thinking to. He was quiet for a moment, looking out the window toward the tree line ridgeline would eventually clear, watching it the way he used to watch weather roll in over the ridge, and then he said, "You'd already decided what made sense for this family before you asked me. I wasn't going to argue about the part you'd already settled on, but I wasn't going to let it cost me the part I still had a say in." I asked whether he'd ever thought about telling me sooner, about making sure I understood, before I ever proposed the swap, that there was more at stake on that land than either of us discussed on that porch, whether some part of him had wanted me to find out sooner rather than later. He looked at me for a long moment and said, "I wasn't keeping it from you to prove a point, son. I was making sure that whatever you decided about the houses, it wouldn't be the thing that decided everything else. That was the whole of it." He didn't explain further, and I didn't ask him to. Some sentences carry more weight for what they refuse to spend on themselves, and I understood, sitting in that kitchen with the letter still between us, the same table where he'd once helped me with fractions as a boy, that this was as close as my father was ever going to come to telling me he'd been protecting something for this family long before I'd ever thought to ask if there was anything left to protect. The weeks that followed, I did the concrete work rather than the emotional kind, because I understood by then that with my father, actions had always mattered more than sentiment, and that this was a trait I'd inherited from him without ever properly crediting the source. I sat down with him and Curtis together, not to undo anything he'd arranged, since I understood by then that it had all been arranged with more care and foresight than I could have managed myself, but to make sure I finally understood the whole of it, and to formally include myself, at his invitation this time, rather than my own initiative, in the long-term planning around the land and the trust he'd set up for the grandchildren. Curtis walked me through the whole structure over 2 long meetings: the staged ridgeline payments, the care fund, the education trust, my father asking sharp, specific questions the entire time that reminded me, uncomfortably, of exactly the kind of scrutiny I'd assumed he'd stopped bringing to anything since the day he agreed to the guest house. Questions about payout timing and tax implications that Curtis later told me, privately, were better informed than most of the questions he got from clients decades younger, with far more financial experience than a retired small-engine repairman had any obvious reason to have accumulated. Curtis mentioned, near the end of the second meeting, almost as an aside, that in 30 years of practice he'd rarely seen a client my father's age move through a restructuring this complex, with as little hand-holding as my father had required, asking better questions in a single afternoon than most clients half his age asked across an entire engagement. I told Danielle everything, including the parts where I'd clearly misjudged what my father's quiet agreement had actually meant, and together we made a point of restoring some of what the house swap had taken from him without ever asking, not the main house itself, which he waved off without hesitation when I offered to switch back, telling me plainly that a man his age had no use for that many stairs and that many bedrooms, and that 5 grandchildren underfoot was exactly the kind of chaos he'd rather visit than live inside of, but the garden along the south wall of the main house, which we'd let go fallow since the move, weeds working their way up through what used to be tidy rows of tomatoes and beans, and which I spent a weekend restoring myself so he could keep working it the way he always had, walking across the yard each morning the way he'd walked to that garden for 30 years, before I'd ever asked him to give up the house behind it, the same worn path through the grass reappearing within a month of him tending it again. At Thanksgiving that year, in front of the whole family, aunts and cousins who'd known nothing of any of this gathered around the same long table my father had built with his own hands the same summer he cleared the first acre. I told them plainly that the security this family now had, the trust for the kids' education, the buffer against whatever came next for my father's care, belonged entirely to his judgment and nobody else's, and that I owed him the kind of credit I'd been too quick to assume I didn't need to give, a correction I made without softening it or trying to make myself look better in the telling. My aunt, the same one who still tells the story about the 1987 offer, looked at my father for a long moment across that table, something passing between them I couldn't quite read, before she simply said, "Well, Walter, you never did tell anybody anything until you were good and ready." My father didn't make a show of any of it. He nodded once, the way he'd nod at a measurement he wasn't going to double-check, and went back to helping my youngest son stack woodblocks on the porch railing, entirely unbothered by having just been credited, in front of a room full of family, with the single most consequential decision any of us had made about that land in 40 years, as though the credit itself mattered to him less than making sure the blocks didn't topple. His acceptance of the correction was exactly as measured as everything else about him, and I understood, by then, that this measured quality was the highest form of approval he'd ever offered anyone in this family, and that I'd spent most of my adult life failing to recognize it as one. I don't know how to close a story like this with anything grander than what actually happened, which is that I spent 2 years believing my father's quick agreement was a man conceding ground, when it was simply a man who'd already secured the ground that mattered, and had nothing left to argue about on the part that didn't. There's a particular kind of pride that assumes a quiet man has run out of moves the moment he stops resisting where you can see it, and I carried that pride long enough that it nearly cost me the chance to understand, while he was still here to explain it himself, exactly how much he'd already done to protect this family before I'd ever thought there was anything left worth protecting. A lesson I suspect most sons only learn once, and only ever the hard way. I think now about the way my mother used to describe him, thinking in seasons rather than afternoons, and I understand now that this wasn't a quirk of temperament so much as a discipline, the same discipline that let him sit on a 14-acre parcel for 4 decades without selling. That let him quietly build an entire plan around 9 wooded acres nobody in the family had ever thought twice about, patient enough to let a whole season pass before answering a question I'd assumed had an obvious, immediate answer. I think, too, about that cedar box he carried out himself rather than let the kids pack. The one detail from that moving weekend I noticed, and forgot until the letter made me remember it, small enough to fit in one hand, the kind of thing a man keeps close, because it holds more than its size would suggest. I never did ask him what was in it, and I'm not sure I need to know. Some things a man carries out himself, and the carrying is the whole of the message, if you're paying enough attention to notice it the first time rather than 2 years later. My father never raised his voice through any part of it. He never needed to. He'd finished securing what mattered a full season before I ever asked him to give up a house, and he let me believe for 2 years that I was the one being generous. I still walk that garden with him some mornings now, the two of us saying very little, the way we always have when the thing between us doesn't need saying out loud anymore. I don't know that we'll ever talk about the cedar box, or the 18 months, or the exact shape of what he was protecting and why he chose silence over explanation. I've made my peace with that. Some men show you the whole of their care only once, at the moment it finally matters, and expect you to understand that the years of quiet before it were never absence. They were the work. If this one sat with you the way it sat with me, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more measured, honest stories.